So the other part of the story is that some organizations are starting to do this work at different places within their sort of journey. So they might start with practicing conscious capitalism for a number of years, and then deciding to do certified B Corp, or then deciding to become a benefit corporation. And so like there's no right or wrong way to approach the work. And that's why the chapter exists, because it just allows entry for anybody wherever they are at to start to learn and meet other business leaders that are starting to practice or have a similar mindset. And so that's why we do these ongoing sessions. So I'm just going to pause to see what questions people have. Does it all make more sense? Or at least a little bit? Okay, so I'm going to just share maybe a little. Would you be interested in hearing a little bit about the origination of conscious capitalism? Because it kind of is wrapped up in the story of how this whole movement came to be. So on one of those slides previously, I showed, we showed that there was an opportunity to make more money. that over the long term, when you do a study of businesses that are practicing conscious business in any ways that we've just described, that they are more profitable. And they outperform the S&P 500 by 14 times. So there's a book that is the beginning of this process called Firms of Endearment. And it was written by a gentleman named Raj Sisodia with some other academics. And Raj Sisodia, it was a marketing, or is a marketing academic, a professor, and he's moved between different universities and colleges. But he was writing a book called Firms of Endearment, and they were really looking at organizations that practice business in a different way, that they had heard like through the grapevine that they did things differently in those businesses, and they wanted to examine like what are they doing. So they came up with a list of businesses, and they wrote this book called Firms of Endearment. Whole Foods was one of the organizations featured in the book. And this is Whole Foods prior to Amazon acquisition. So Whole Foods is featured in the book. And John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods, is on an airplane with one of the people that was involved in publishing the book. And they ended up sitting next to each other. And John Mackey and the person started talking, and the person said, well, your company is actually featured in a book that I'm involved with called Firms of Endearment. By Raj Sisodia. And they sent John Mackey the manuscript for him to read. And he was really excited that Whole Foods was included in the book. At the same time, other people were reading the book and saying, well, this is all great. And like, it's really inspiring to see all these stories of different companies doing business in different ways. But has anyone looked at the financials of these companies, which they hadn't thought of doing? And so they then looked at the financials, and that's when they discovered that the financials longer term were far and away in comparison to other companies outperforming. So it was kind of by accident that was discovered. Then because John Mackey was featured and Raj had written the book, they ended up meeting and starting to talk about their passion around running businesses in a different way. And they are the two that founded Conscious Capitalism. So John had already founded Whole Foods in Austin, Texas, many, many years prior, and had been running Whole Foods according to Conscious Capitalism, but it wasn't named that for many, many years. And Raj had written the Firms of Endearment book where he was trying to study this academically. They came together, founded Conscious Capitalism, and the first meetings of Conscious Capitalism were very similar to this meeting, like 5 or 6 people just sitting around talking about how they thought this was important. And now it's a worldwide movement, has a large board of directors, and has events and conferences, certainly much more pre-COVID, but that will return, events and conferences all over the world. And lots of collaboration with many of the other parts of the movement that we've talked about. They're a member of Imperative 21, like we talked about before, really strong partnership with the B Corp movement. And so everybody's trying to work collaboratively together to make this happen. And then and then people often ask, well, what happened with Whole Foods? Because John Mackey is our founder. Whole Foods has gone through a transition. They're now under Amazon, which I, in my opinion, would say is one of the least conscious businesses in the world. And so if you think about, and in the conscious business movement, we have sort of ratings of different stages of the journey. And the first rating is like a bad actor, like you're just a bad company, like you actually try to break laws, up to the point where you're like fully conscious business. And there's 5 stages in between. So you can think about like Whole Foods at its beginning stages, and for its number of years at its first, it was at the upper end of that spectrum. And it merges with Amazon at the lower end of that spectrum. And the way the story goes is really interesting because it wraps into benefit corporations. So Amazon was founded, as I said, in Austin. John Mackey, it was not Amazon, sorry, Whole Foods. Whole Foods was founded in Austin by John Mackey, and it was the one store. And John Mackey, I know, really practiced. I've seen him talk about this. I know he really practiced all of the elements of conscious capitalism before it was even named, because the first example we see is there was a devastating flood that he tells a story about, and you can read this in the Conscious Capitalism book if you're interested too. A devastating flood that they had at the first Whole Foods that basically wiped out the whole store. There was like a huge flood in Austin, Texas, and like the Whole Foods store was totally wiped out. And the community and the employees and the customers all came together to rebuild the store. And that what John Mackey tells that as, I don't do justice to his speech, but tells that as like, it was the first time he realized like, wow, we have really done something special. Like I was ready to walk away because I can't rebuild this store by myself, nor can my leadership team. Like we were dead, and everyone rallied together to build Whole Foods back up. Now, fast forward a lot of years later, Whole Foods has activist shareholders. So if you're familiar with activist shareholders, they sometimes own a very small portion of a public company, but can have an outsized impact and outsized voice in what they want that company to do. So John Mackey was running Whole Foods as a conscious business in the way that we've been overviewing. And he had activist shareholders saying that he was not maximizing shareholder value. And they were threatening to take over Whole Foods and threatening to push John Mackey out of Whole Foods and his whole leadership team to actually change the whole structure of the company, which has happened before with other companies. So it's not unlikely necessarily to happen. And he describes it that he was losing sleep trying to figure out what to do. He didn't want to lose the soul of the company. And that Jeff Bezos called him and said, I'm probably the only place you can take shelter in order to figure this out. So John Mackey was able to maintain ownership and leadership within Whole Foods. Ownership, it's a public company, but ownership in like the figurative sense, and still continue to lead the organization under the Amazon umbrella. Now that has had different impacts that I'm sure nobody could have anticipated playing out. But the way that John Mackey tells it, and I don't have no idea, because we're in a long-term game here, right? So we're talking about long-term impact, not short-term impact, which is a completely different way of thinking about business than we typically do. John Mackey's idea was that he was going to infiltrate Amazon from the inside. We'll see. It's going to take a really long time. Jeff Bezos is not going to be the CEO. I can't remember if that's already happened or it's going to happen. And so John Mackey said, if there's a place where I need to influence how business gets done, it is within Amazon. So he got a way to get to the leadership directly because he's on the leadership. So I know that there has been, from a Whole Foods customer's perspective, employees' perspective, definitely some more negotiation the other way as well, in terms of feeling more like Amazon potentially. And that this will probably go on for a while, where it's jockeying a little bit back and forth, and then we'll have to see how the story plays out. But that comes up very often when people want to understand that full context of how do these. So the moral of the story around benefit corporation is, what John Mackey has said in the times that I've seen him speak about this is, if I had only known or thought about moving to a benefit corporation, I would have had the legal protection against the activist shareholders who were coming after us to say that we weren't maximizing shareholder value, because they were saying, as a business that was designated as a C Corp or an S Corp, that there was a legal obligation to maximize shareholder value, and that John Mackey was blocking that. And they were going to use that as their evidence to take over Whole Foods. If he had been a benefit corporation, they wouldn't have been legally able to make that case, because the benefit corporation is designated to add value to all stakeholders, which is how John Mackey was running the business. So it's another reason to be considering. I mean, there's not many companies in Maine that are worried about activist shareholders, but there are board members or investors that might be misaligned with the way that the CEO is running the business in order to maximize long-term value to stakeholders. And so if those individuals are still in there and pushing for profit maximization, and the business is being led differently, then there's going to be constant tension, and there's risk that CEO will be ousted because they're not aligned with how the investors or the shareholders think business should be done or money should be made. And so the benefit corporation is a great thing to facilitate, to make sure there's that full alignment of all of the stakeholders in what's trying to be achieved. And so John Mackey said, like, I just wish that I had had the wisdom to pursue that, because it would have avoided the mess. So hopefully that story demonstrates how all that stuff comes together a little bit, and how important it is to be thoughtful around where you are, where your organization is in the journey. Do you have authentic, genuine leadership that wants to lead this? Because it is not easy to do. This is not an easy thing to do, or else maybe other organizations would be doing it, because it does lead to more profit long-term. But you're going up against, well, certainly since the 1970s, Milton Friedman, if you've heard of him as a very famous economist, was the one that declared, and everyone took this by storm in economics, of like that the reason for companies existing was to maximize shareholder profit. So from the 70s, this has been the basic definition of what business exists for. And we're just in the last 10 years trying to say that's not it. But there's been many, many years built up of, if you think about what's reported for public companies in the short-term orientation of quarterly earnings, and making sure that money is being made. And if you worked in a public organization, as I have, you know how much revolves around the investors and the board, and making sure that you're demonstrating that you're making money quarter over quarter. That system is deeply embedded in our society. So if you are a leader that's trying to lead differently, particularly in a public company, and you can look for the stories, very sadly, of Danone. Danone had a leader that was leading in a conscious business, from a conscious business perspective, and actually led the organization through the biggest certified B Corp initiative. And he was just ousted because they said he wasn't financially successful enough. And that was with general alignment of what needed to happen. And they just kicked him out. And if you read the stories, it's pretty clear it was just because he was not making enough money. He was, in comparison to some other of their competitors, that were making more money, more short-term money. And Unilever is another example of a company that had Ron Pohlman as its leading in a very conscious way. And these are huge companies that are really setting a role model to do it. And they couldn't sustain it either. Ron Pohlman actually refused to do quarterly earning reports. So they're little by little trying to change the system, but they're embedded in a very deeply ingrained system. So you're a very courageous CEO in a public company if you're trying to do this, because you're probably going to have you'll probably be transitioned out at some point. We're just going to have to little by little keep making progress. If you're a private company or a smaller company, thankfully you can do whatever you want. And that's a lot easier. And we need more and more of those. And of course, in Maine, that's what we mostly are. So that makes it a little bit easier to continue this movement and have lots of momentum in Maine. Okay, so we have just a few minutes left. And so I'm just going to stop talking and ask for what other questions people have. That's kind of all the content and story sharing and background. And then more to come in the other sessions around the tenets of conscious capitalism. So this just gives you sort of the overview and the context. What questions do folks have?
Well, I don't know that I have a specific question. Well, I have a whole lot of questions. I have weeks of questions, I think. But it's just I'm just really thankful that we continue to have the dialogue just as a very broad community, because there were a number of moments, on certain slides where I thought, it's just really disappointing. And I'm speaking from a sort of a personal perspective and how we've been ingrained that there's just such skepticism. And you said cynicism. I was thinking distrust, about, it was the slide about the business roundtable and the CEO saying that. And man, do I want to believe that they believe.
Yeah.
But it is so hard. And when, and this conversation about, having, these CEOs who believe and they want to make change within a completely alter competing structure of shareholder driven, that kudos to them. But it's such a, it's such a conflict. And it's just, I'm glad we're having the conversation, I guess. Yeah. Is my stumbling point.
No, that's awesome. Well, it's like any societal movement, any societal change has to happen with a number of people like us, across a number of different places, all starting to have the conversation and figure out how to move it forward. And some of these people that we've been talking about were the front runners and we're taking significant amount of risk. But the more that we are all supporting that, either through our time or our, the companies that we buy products from, or the companies that we work for, or the companies that we engage with as community members, like we have a lot of collective power to make this shift. And that's really what it's about is why I love this session is it's showing that, conscious capitalism is an important player in this collective power, but there's so many organizations doing this and so many fun things to pay attention to in the movement.
So may I ask, and if we need to think about it, or if anything strikes anybody later, do you know of case studies that have shown or resources that have shown, when you are thinking in terms of abundance or conscious capitalism, that you can derive profit and therefore do greater good. And, but I wanted to take a step back into the weeds with that. In what are some of those examples that, one could point to in a conversation like that?
Yeah, there's lots of examples. I would point you to first going to that book that I mentioned, Firms of Endearment.
Yes.
Because that's where there is tons of examples of companies that you'd be able to point to. And because of what they did with their process, they added in the financial piece to it. Mm-hmm. There's also if you actually go on my website, which is consciousrevolution.biz, on the front page of it is some other data, if you're interested in seeing that. And you can look at the sources for that data, and we'll show you some other places where you can find good information. And Conscious Company Media, which is, thanks, Emma, which is no longer an organization, but is actually gonna have a rebirth at some point. There's like some political weird things that were happening. But Conscious Company Media, if you look up their archives, has a lot of stories and a lot of data that they've shared over the last 5 years or so. So if you plug in Conscious Company Media, you will find they have like some really good infographics and storytelling. And that was basically what Conscious Company Media was there to do, was to share the stories of conscious businesses and share the data around them.
And yours was Conscious Revolution?
Consciousrevolution.biz. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. What other questions do folks have?
I remember reading the magazines. I don't know if you can call them magazines that they used to, the Conscious Media Collective would, put out, and they had them in Whole Foods before Whole Foods got bought. I was just curious to hear from you, like in Portland and Maine in general, how you've seen kind of this movement shift or change or grow. I mean, it definitely feels like there's momentum, and not just because of COVID, and but certainly also with things like Black Lives Matter, and there's been a lot in the last 12 months in particular. But yeah, I'm just curious to get your perspective on that for sort of our local community.
Yeah. Well, we have 200 members of the Conscious Capitalism chapter, and that's over, and we're looked at as one of the fastest growing chapters in the conscious business movement. So I think that's one testament to that. I could also share, I first went to the Conscious Capitalism conference when those were happening a couple of years, maybe 3 years ago now. And I was looking while I was there for people from Maine, because I figured, well, there's probably someone else from Maine. There was like 4,000 people there or something. And I after going around, I found out that I was the only person from Maine. I was like, oh, well, this is clearly not right, because I know that there are so many leaders in Maine that are thinking this way. And I also know that people make a decision to live and work in Maine from a very values, principally oriented perspective. And so a lot of this will resonate. Thanks for coming, Bay. A lot of this will resonate with them. And so that was the motivation to pulling the chapter together. It was kind of an experiment of who can we bring together initially, and then how do we gain momentum? And since then, it's been all sort of organic growth, meaning members have said to other members like, hey, I think you might want to come to this. And that's how we got to the 200 people on the mailing list and engaged. And we have different people engaging at different times. So I think we're just at the beginning of bringing people in. What we hear often is, oh, I've been doing this a lot myself for my career or the way I've been leading. I just didn't know it was named something. I didn't know there was a movement around it. I didn't know there was a framework. I didn't know there was a language. And when they find that and other people that are like-minded, it is such a relief, and they feel like they've come home to the right community, because often they feel like they're on their own out there, because they're often interacting with traditional business leaders that are thinking about business in a more traditional or sort of old paradigm way. So we're just getting started, I think.
I was just going to share, but I have to jump off too. I had the same experience attending Social Venture Circle, which is very much aligned in mission. And a guy who introduced himself to me. He said, I went through all the people that are here, and you're the only other person from Maine. So just wanted to say hi.
Oh, yeah. That's awesome. Well, I want to hear more about that. Social Venture Circle, Bobby. We'll have to do that another time. I know you have to go, but thank you so much.
Yeah, I can forward if you want to, because actually a lot of their things have been free and online now.
Okay, that'd be interesting.
Previously, you had to be a member to do it. So I will forward that so you can get on the mailing list.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for coming.
All right, nice to meet everyone.
Nice to meet you too. So Sandra and Gretchen, don't want to hold you up, but if you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer anything as well.
I don't have any other questions. I just really, like I said, I appreciate the conversation and the opportunity to learn. Good.
Okay, that's what it's all about. Absolutely. Anything for you, Gretchen?
No, this was great. I'm glad we had a small group in many ways so we could chat and then get our questions in, and I'm excited to continue attending sessions. I heard about this from Elizabeth Ross Holmstrom.
Great.
She was a board member of a nonprofit that I used to work at. And she and I have kept in touch, and she was like, you would love this group. You have to get.
Bye.
Bye.